Welcome to Inquiry into Self. And this is part 6 in my 7-part series where I'm sharing my personal experience of arriving at sensing peace as the nature of existence, even during upheaval. And in this one, I'm going to tackle a very difficult topic, and that is children suffering. So, everybody seems to agree that children should not be abused, children should not be suffering in wars, etc. And it's clearly something that within the human consciousness we're trying to do better at. So there is that within the nature of existence, within us, within infinite being, that is growing beyond that. But as it is right now, today anyways, children are suffering and dying in various situations, including wars. So I started looking at this and I could feel, the initial war within me that wants to stop that and condemn it. And I know there's different ways of saying no. You can say, no, this is not allowed, and stop something, or you can say, no, this is terrible, you shouldn't be doing this, in a shaming sort of way. Like when you get a ticket, if you're speeding and the police officer comes, what was your speed? We saw this, here's your ticket. Or they could say, you're a terrible driver, what are you thinking, aren't you stupid? And that would be very demeaning. So there's different ways to stop something and say this is not acceptable without that outrage of demeaning and terrorizing the other person. And I could feel inside of me, that outrage and that wanting to tell the other people how terrible they are, right? To make them feel bad. But that's definitely a war within me, a war within what is. And it doesn't help anything. If anything, it probably makes it worse. How are they going to grow past their experience if they're also having to handle all that shame? So now I had to sit with this war in myself. And I went into inquiry. And the first one was, children should suffer. And I didn't really find that went very far. So I did another one. Children don't suffer. And I actually realized that I was adding a whole lot of story. I know that when I was a child and I went through some painful times, I didn't make them mean quite as much as what I can feel myself wanting to make things mean now that I'm adult with greater perspective. I somehow just survived. I had my coping mechanism and I did what I did and I got through. But there's a whole lot more meaning that I actually add, a whole lot more suffering that I add into the world when I start really elaborating on this is what's happening to them and this is what's going to happen in the world and this is the kind of person they're going to be. And, it's kind of agonizing on agonizing. So I had to admit there's something for me to learn there. And then I did another one, I shouldn't make children suffer. That one was really rich because I can feel the inner child in myself. And there used to be times when I would just run right over any time that I felt vulnerable. The vulnerability would come up, the tenderness would come up, the fear, the anxiety, the hurt, the shame, whatever it was. And I would push it out as an unacceptable feeling and take on my managerial competence and just shove forward, paying no heed to that vulnerability that was coming up. And as I acknowledged that I had overrun my own vulnerability, I realized that part of the anger towards these people hurting the children was actually this own sense of not wanting vulnerableness, not being comfortable with vulnerability. And these hurting children represented that. And I was mad at these people because they were bringing that up for me. This universal feeling we have about that probably does reflect a certain amount of discomfort with our own vulnerability. And rather than dealing with that, we project it out and heap even more shame on the people who cause vulnerable children to suffer. So it really became really important for me to address that I made space for vulnerability, that I created compassion, that I looked into it, that I journaled and understood it. It's a very long process. This is not something that happens in a month or even a year, but it just became this really important thing for me to make space and allowance for my vulnerability in any way it came up. I mean, here's a small example, but when my renters said they didn't want to renew their lease because they wanted to look for another place, I got nervous. Well, what if they find someplace else and they just leave me? And I could tell that I had tried to set things up so they'd have to give me a certain amount of notice, right? But I want them to be in the happiest place for them. And I let myself feel the vulnerability. I connected with this part that really wants them to be happy. And I said, sure, take as much time as you need. We'll work out the lease if you end up deciding to stay. And, it's really good feeling to notice that I could be with my vulnerability and still be the bigger person that I know I want to be. So this engaging with our own vulnerability really, for me, changes how I experience peace in the world. Once I'm comfortable with my own vulnerability, the whole world feels like a more peaceful place because vulnerability is not a sense of threat anymore. It's not something I have to avoid and protect and, go on a witch hunt for. So now I've had this greater ability to know that whatever is happening, I don't have to argue with it and project more conflict into it. And I can feel that there is a lot of good coming in, a lot of people protecting children, a lot of people noticing that vulnerability has a place in the world. And just by feeling that in myself, I notice it and feel it more in the world. It's kind of like when you buy a new car, suddenly you see that version of car all over the place. When I feel the peace and okayness with vulnerability, I start seeing it everywhere in the world. And so I feel there is this amazing permeating peace, even in times of war and upheaval.